Answer Me in Africa, March 11th, 1998. Dear Fred and Father, well, I put it off as long as I could. This letter writing isn't easy for me. Actually, the writing is. It's the starting that's the hard part. Let's see, what can I tell you? Taylor went to a rock concert in a snowstorm last night and backed into someone in a crowded parking lot on the way out. Nobody injured, just a ding in the armor. Court is doing great. She has the energy of a shark, always moving, and I have a hard time keeping up with her. I have a lot to work with there. She has now moved into position number 1 as Taylor is in his bed this morning, licking his wounds from last night. He feels bad, and I have a hard time not laughing. At least no one was hurt. It's the memories that count. I can still feel the sting from my youth, sliding down a hill in my 55 Chevy into an errant motorist in my lane. Pure ice. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, remember? Fred never should have let me drive in those conditions. It wasn't my fault, but I remember the judge saying, "You were driving the car. You saw the other car sideways in your lane. You failed to control your car. It's as much your fault as the person who was in your way." Nasty lesson. Nobody hurt. Move on. Speaking of moving on, there was something I was going to tell you, but I forgot. You know that damn memory of mine. That's your fault, too. I, however, am trying to rise above my environment and do my sworn duty. Duties, those things you're supposed to do, but if you're clever, you can usually sidestep them, or at the very least, play stupid. I should have sent you folks a postcard from Japan, but since I didn't, I had to pay penitence and write a story about it. Now, for some reason, I feel I'm duty-bound to send you something about Africa. If it weren't for duty, I'd probably never write. I'm lazy. Genetics. Must skip a generation or two. I certainly didn't get it from you folks. However, my main goal in life is to keep ambition at bay. Duty calls. Enclosed you will find the African postcards from Nairobi. Okay, they're not postcards. They're 301 photos, excluding the roll of 36 black and white ones being developed. On the back of each one, I did my duty and described the scenes as best I could. By hand. And yes, it was painful. Other than the comments on the back of those pictures, this is all I remember. Jeffrey. Into Africa. There's an old saying, "The best laid plans of mice and men." Historically speaking, I think anyone who knows me would agree that I consistently placed well below the mice on the scale. It's not my fault. I have that point A to point B mentality. When I get to point B, I'll let you know the next point A. It's only a two-way path. It's only forward or back, and since back is not an option, that only leaves forward. Well, let's just say on this trip, I really outdid the mice. Actually, I may have put in a new low on the moderation scale. Russell would come. I knew he would come. I would have bet my life on it. He didn't come. I could have died. And yet, I owe my life as I am today to the man who never showed. If it weren't for him, I may never have learned the lessons that needed learning. My mother always told me that when life serves up vinegar, look around for a good pickle recipe. Well, Fred, you really wouldn't say that, but you lived it. So when I ended up in the black hole of Africa, aka Nairobi, it was only natural that as usual, I speed to the climax. This story began a long time ago, and if I don't start at the beginning, then I just look like the Jimka, Swahili for fool, that I am. It all started when I was a child watching Tarzan movies. Oh, sorry, too far back. What can I say about Russell? He was my friend. It was over 20 years ago when he started telling me about the time he had spent in Africa. I paid a lot of attention, but to be honest, I'm not sure if he was in the Peace Corps or what. The point is, he was there. The Dark Continent. smack dab in the middle of humanity's birthplace, right next to the equator. The sun doesn't get any closer. He talked about the bugs, the mosquitoes, the crawly things that wanted to kill you, and the other things that would kill you just because you were in the way. He told me how he and a buddy had signed up for a tour of Africa, the theory being that they would travel together during their tour. As chance would have it, Russell was sent to the Rusenga Province, an island in the middle of Lake Victoria. His friend was stuck being a gopher in the palace of Idi Amin. I always thought Russell was the lucky one. Word has it that when he got off the plane in Omaha, his own mama didn't recognize him. I find it hard to believe that he survived the experience, but that was then. This is now. It was a snowy day the last night before I left. This one had me spooked. I know I've been to Japan, Australia, and other far-off places in the world, but I didn't like leaving for longer than 2 weeks. To me, that's too long. 10 days. Hell, you can always round down and call it a week. 14 days is 2 weeks. You can't make them shorter, so you just try to fill them up before the money runs out. Little did I know I was about to spend one of those 2 weeks waiting for Russell in Nairobi. Poor Russell. He really wanted to go, but as the real world would have it, he was knee-deep in a lawsuit that was making front-page news in the Denver Post. It just so happened that the lawsuit involved my current employer and Russell's corporation that does business with us. I didn't know the specifics, but it was bad timing. You can't run off to Africa when your business is in the process of recuperating 6 to 7 digits of accounts receivable. I should have known that it was going to be an adventure when I started to pack. The pack actually became an issue. I had commissioned a custom backpack made to my specifications for the trip. It wasn't finished in time. But when it is, it should be a dandy. There I was the night before, stuffing one-way merchandise into my old pack. North Face makes a good bag, but just too big for a plane ride. I have a motto when it comes to flying. If I can stuff it in a pack and be able to military press it into the overhead, it meets airline standards. I overdid it in all the wrong areas, as usual. Didn't really need the $40 mosquito-netted hammock. If I'd used it, the baboons would have used me as a teeter-totter before they ripped me apart. As always, taking too many clothes wasn't any problem that couldn't be jettisoned. The old jewelry and watches Diane and Court gave me seemed to be good choices as far as volume goes. I also took a couple of old pipes, packages of tobacco, and rolling papers. Excellent trading stock from what I had heard. After a very restless night, I had everything in the car, only after making an early morning run to Walmart for binoculars and little packages of Kleenex. Since it was Sunday and Taylor had already scheduled a paintball party, he didn't make the ride to the airport. It was just a quick hug and see you later type of thing. It always seems easiest that way, but, of course, with Court it was never easy. She not only wanted to go, but she wanted to stay and watch the airplanes. The time went very fast sitting there in the airport. When you've got a wonderful life, you wonder why you do anything that might alter it. But instead of listening to that inner voice, I found myself rationalizing irrational behavior. Realizing on the way to the gate that I had no reading material with me, I was fortunate to find the airport bookstore open. After a few minutes of browsing, the owner asked where I was going. Kenya, was the reply. Oh, was the answer. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "They have an article in the New York Times today about Kenya." "Can I see it?" I inquired. He handed it to me. On page 3 of the first section, in bold letters, the headline read, "No good news out of Kenya." I laughed. It was not one of those fake bravado laughs you give when you're scared. It was a burst-out-loud laugh, one of those times when you really can't believe the absurdity of the moment. Anyway, I laughed the laugh of an ignorant man, too stupid to be scared off the path I had already set for myself. There was only one mode: forward. So, forward I went. With my heart on my sleeve, and a paper one that Diane hid in my pack, I boarded the plane. Hoping against hope that Russell would be waiting in Minneapolis, I waved to my wife and daughter. Catching a glimpse of them through the window caused me to choke down tears. The Indians always said that every day should be a good day to die. I can tell you that when you really have a good one, you don't want to let it go. I arrived in Minneapolis, and no Russell. Well, let's not stop long enough to think about this. Just get on the plane to Boston and wait. I did, and called Russell to reconfirm. He said he was trying his damnedest. They were hoping for a settlement, and as soon as the ink dried, we'd meet in Nairobi. That's all I wanted to hear. To be honest, I only called him so I could tell Diane not to worry. Russell would be on his way. I, on the other hand, began my overseas flight by claiming the right to a middle seat in a row of 5 people. It was only 7 or 8 hours of pure torture, but those flights are designed to be that way. Upon reaching Amsterdam, I roamed their airport waiting for my next flight. I had 4 hours to kill. I walked around the airport with my 80-pound pack and looked, sometimes at the people, sometimes at things, and sometimes foregoing the visual stimulations and letting my other senses soak in the flavor of the atmosphere and the environment. This airport had a very positive scent to it. They had a large childcare facility, a casino, shops selling flowers, candy, cameras, and liquor. You name it. There seemed to be a shop selling it. I meant to buy some souvenirs, but sometimes looking is just as good as carrying. Besides, I'd lose it, break it, or in some fashion, render whatever I bought into something worthless. I'm not bragging, it's just a fact. By merely looking, I can remember plenty of neat stuff I could have bought if I really had money. Of course, if I really had money, I wouldn't be standing in the middle of a strange airport, waiting to go to a strange land with, well, strangers. My hair was already beginning to stand on end, and this was the civilized part of the world. Thank the airline gods that there were only 8 more hours of flying from Amsterdam to Nairobi. If a person were to have any doubts about the wisdom of such a trip, there was plenty of time to rationalize them away. During the flight over, I talked with an elderly gentleman who worked in Nairobi. He said to be careful. I told him I had a tent to sleep in, and I was going to wait for my buddy to show up. He recommended that I get a room the first night and think about what I was doing. Sometimes messages are given at various levels. I got his. Flying from Amsterdam to Nairobi in the daylight was a pleasure. I had an aisle seat this time, but I could still manage to see out the window. The Alps, the boot of Italy, the Mediterranean Sea, and then they disappeared and there was nothing but desert. I looked for the pyramids and all the other landmarks, but at 36,000 feet, let's get real. Anything I saw was with imagination. Only the desert was real. The drifting sand from that altitude made it easy to see how the wind had formed their shapeless image. The desert was an ocean of brown with random islands of rocks protruding desperately above the sand. Intermittently, mountains stood in the way and were slowly being covered with a layer of sand as the desert continued its slow march south. And of course, there was the Nile, a long green snake slithering its way through the dunes. Even from our cruising altitude, you could see the green edges along the blue water. Next to the green, there was just brown. It was a long flight, and of course, the in-flight movie, Air Bud, was one that Court and I have watched at least 5 times. Nevertheless, anything to kill the monotony of the flight was a welcome relief. By the time I reached Nairobi, it was close to 48 hours since I had had any real sleep. Yet there are those moments when you wake up from a quick cat nap, startled, to realize that you're drooling on your neighbor's chair. This happens because the body was not designed to sit in an upright position for extended periods of time. At least mine isn't. You'll never hear me say it again, but I was glad to get to Nairobi. We arrived at night, or should I say, around dusk. The rains had stopped just as we pulled into our gate. Nairobi International. It reminded me a lot of the run-down International Airport in Washington, D.C. Same kind of dismal maintenance in an old facility. But that was only a piece of its charm. The main terminal was filled with people waiting for other people, so that they might be able to sell something. Upon disembarking the KLM luxury airliner, there was an instant recognition of heat, but it didn't make you sweat. The atmosphere was a lot like Denver, only hotter. I can't say what the actual temperature was since I don't keep track of those things, but being a seasoned traveler, one thing I always did was scout the airport. I wanted to make sure I knew the layout of the area, so when it was time to leave, I knew where to go. I took a stroll through the shops. They didn't possess the same flair as the ones in Amsterdam. I was forewarned by fellow travelers who commuted in and out of the country that the airport would be noisy with a sudden onrush of taxi drivers trying to snag a fare, as well as the mix of vendors peddling their wares. I hung off to one side as my flight flooded the airport with new activity. I decided to have a beer at the airport bar and see if I could gather any information. I was in no rush. I had no place to go. It wasn't too long before I struck up a conversation with the bartender and was discussing the logistics of the situation when another traveler, Austin, a Kenyan I think, offered to buy one of my Swisher Sweet cigars from me. I smiled and said, "Here, just take one." That Midwestern good old boy behavior didn't play too smart in Nairobi. I probably should have just told him to go pound sand and not cross my path again. I didn't. We sat and talked, and I bought him a beer for his advice. To his credit, he answered the questions I asked. I needed the location of a cheap hotel in the middle of town, close to the American Embassy, and he gave me an address. I said thank you and was off. It was my turn to go through customs. The security check in Nairobi was somewhat lax. Immigrations was a place that let anyone in, as long as there might be a profit in it for their country. I only know it was a place I'd pay to leave. But the real issue at this point in time was transportation. I thought I could simply catch a taxi to the hotel, but as soon as my passport was stamped, the cabbies came swarming like a plague of locusts. There were so many choices, I was sure I was going to make the wrong one. Actually, I did. My logic was that the guy standing in front of the Hertz counter would be a good choice. However, as he was leading me through a side door exit from the airport, an angry official in a uniform with a walkie-talkie came over, grabbed me, and literally pulled me to the front door and put me in a cab. I don't know what the side door business was all about, but luckily fate stepped in and pulled me out of the clutches of doom. Before long, I was rocketing down a road similar to one you might drive on when you're trying to dump a body. As it turned out, it was the main road into the city from the outlying airport. The hotel cost 800 shillings, a little over $5. You can see from the pictures I sent, it really doesn't look too bad for the price. On the first night, I just wanted a bed to crash in, so I really didn't care if the hotel had a star or not. I'm pretty sure this hotel was not even in the rating system. After I paid the front desk clerk, I was informed that the elevator didn't work. I was on the 4th floor. There were no lights in the stairwell or hallways. I climbed the 8 flights of stairs, somehow found my room in the dark, dumped my stuff, hit the bed, and that's the last thing I remember from the first night. The next morning, after I awoke to a cacophony of noise cascading up to my open, screenless window, I looked outside. I knew the sooner I could get my bearings, the better off I'd be. I studied the surrounding area from my sanctuary. High on my perch, I waited as long as possible before venturing outside. It was like a storing up of courage kind of thing. You have no one to watch your back in this situation, and you know me. I sure wouldn't want to do anything stupid. So what does stupid do? I hung my camera on one side of my shoestring belt and my new binoculars on the other side. I should have just hung a sign around my neck that said, "Tastes like chicken." I wasn't even half a block from my hotel when the lady walking next to me said something. Being halfway deaf to begin with, the hustle-bustle of the street drowned out her voice. I gave my usual smile and continued on my way. She quietly said it again. "There is someone following you." "Huh?" was my stunned reaction. Then she said it a third time, with power and urgency in her voice. "There is someone following you. Cross the street now." I may be a slow country bumpkin from Nebraska, but I got the message. I darted out into 2 lanes of traffic like I knew where I was going. Reaching the other side, I saw the lady again. She just smiled and nodded her head and was gone with the black tide into which I was swept. At this point, I knew that someone was going to thump me and rip off my stuff. I did the only thing I could do. I looked up to the sky and saw it. The Hilton. It was some distance away. If only I could make it there. Moving at a pace that was just short of an all-out sprint, I was met head-on with my second piece of good fortune that day. 2 young men approached me and asked if I wanted to go on safari. My lightning-fast self-preservation reflex told me that if the person following me thinks I'm with someone, he would leave me alone. That was how I met my 2 freelance guides. Hustlers, as we'd call them in New York City. At the time, I didn't realize how lucky I was. These guys proceeded to take me to several different safari agencies. I was walking into buildings I wasn't sure I'd ever come out of, but the options seemed few at the time. I assured everyone I talked to that my friend would be joining me tomorrow, and we would indeed be potential clients. I really didn't want anyone to know I was there alone. After we conversed with the safari agencies, I asked my new guides to take me to the American Embassy. They were more than willing to oblige, as the hope for some kind of tip was how these guys survived. Nightmares in Nairobi. There were 35 million people in Kenya, with 3.5 million of them living in some form of poverty in Nairobi. More than likely, some of the people here had money, but I wasn't one of them. My reason for finding the American Embassy was to let them know I was in the city and to get an update on the current environment. The people at the embassy really could have cared less about me. Everything was about their own safety. After the strip search, not really, but damn near, they sent me through the metal detector so I could get in line with other people waiting to speak to an employee. Now, I never thought about race as being an issue my entire trip. But when you're the only white guy standing in a long line of black people, you, how should we say, stand out, identified only by an obvious birthmark. A lady behind one of the barred teller windows was on her way out of the office for the day when she saw me obediently standing in the one open line. She motioned me over to another window with a closed plaque on its barred window, moved it to one side, and curtly said, "What are you doing here? It's after 4 p.m, and we're usually gone by now as we don't like to be in Nairobi after dark." No shit. After I explained my situation, she was a little kinder to me, but she put all the facts out there. Kenya is in a period of political instability. The elections are over, but tensions are still running high. The streets are a dangerous place to be after dark, or, for that matter, during the day. There's a lot of thumping and running, and tourists are the prime target. The roads are as dangerous as the drivers, and the safest form of travel is flying. Of course, we did have a plane go down yesterday with 8 people aboard. No survivors. Let your wife know where you are, and always carry a dummy bag with a small amount of money in it, or hold some in your hand when you're walking so you can throw it one way and run the other. I stammered, "Oh, okay. Give me your passport. I'll take a photocopy, just in case." "Sure, thanks. Just in case what?" "Just in case." She made a copy and handed it back to me. I said thank you. "Goodbye and good luck," she said, and disappeared, no doubt fleeing the city. Note, the embassy was blown up 2 months later. I've often wondered if she is still alive. I stumbled out of there with a sense of doom that usually doesn't follow me. Once outside, I was delighted to see that my guides, Christopher and Aggery, were waiting for me. I was still a little leery of them, but sometimes you just have to go with your gut. I asked them to take me to a phone so I could call the USA, and the next thing I know, we're walking through back alleys and rundown buildings that haven't seen maintenance since the Queen Mum was in her 30s. We finally reached a little room no bigger than an office cube. It had 2 doors, one on each side, with about 7 people, standing or sitting, waiting to use one of the 2 phones on the desk. The routine goes like this. You give the person behind the desk the number, they dial it for you, hit a stopwatch to time the length of your call, and then hand you the phone. My first call was to Diane's dad, as I knew she was already at school. I told Grandpa that I was alive and well, and to let Diane know there were no problems. I lied. I asked Grandpa about the time, but our connection was poor. He said something about it being 4. I interpreted it to mean it was 4 o'clock. He actually meant that Diane would be home at 4 in the afternoon. I did the calculation, set my watch with a broken wristband to the local time, stuffed it back into my pocket, having learned not to flash luxury items, and from that point on, my schedule for calling home was based on faulty information. It was not a 5-hour difference in time. It was 8. This miscalculation plagued me the entire trip. When my random calls home actually came, nobody ever wanted to say, "Do you know what time it is?" I was always getting someone out of bed, and it was costing about $20 to $30 a pop, so the frequency of my calls was kept to a minimum. The Africans don't like that call-collect stuff either. Too difficult to handle the billing. After the call, I asked my guides if they would direct me to my hotel. They were happy to do so. It meant a tip. It also meant another day of existence for all of us. I was glad to give them 100 shillings each. Once back at the hotel, I knew I was in for the evening, foolishly thinking I would be more secure inside a building. There is no such thing as security, only a false sense of it, or lack of it. I didn't want to go back out there. I was scared, so I rummaged through my pack, found some beef jerky and a book to read. It was so rare an opportunity that I took advantage of the situation. As I was reading, I started to notice the little things in my room. You know, little bugs that scurry out in the light and then dart back into the darkness of cracks and crevices of a building built in the 1930s. At first I thought I should kill these guys, so I chased them around the walls and floor, thumping them when I could catch them. I did this for a little while until I knew it was a lost cause. I had only managed to mortally wound one of the little guys. He was squished over by the bed. Dead, I thought, but it looked as if he were growing. Upon closer inspection, I found it was just a bigger bug eating the smaller one. I decided that there was no sense in providing fresh kill for the larger aggressors in the group. At one point I turned off the light, waited, and then flipped it back on. Yup, just as I thought. They came a-flocking in the dark. After a few experiments confirming the fact that light hampered their excursions, the decision was made. I slept with the lights on, book over my face, on top of the bed with, hopefully, clean towels placed underneath me. The ringing phone woke me about 11 o'clock that night, Nairobi time. I just stared at it. Who the hell would be calling me? Nobody knows where I am. I answered. It was the front desk. "You have a call." "Who is it? I don't know anybody here." "It is a call for Jeff." "Okay, can you transfer it up here?" "No, it is long distance. You have to take it down here." Shields up. We're on major overload here. My first thought was somebody wants to suck me outside my door and thump me on the head. Then another thought flashed. It must be Diane. She's tracked me down in a lot of places, and with her bloodhound ability, I was sure she must have done it again. I'll be right there. As I made my way down the 8 flights of darkened stairwells, every trained taekwondo muscle in my body was ready to react. Once at the front desk, I still wasn't sure if this was a setup or not. I picked up the phone. "Hello? Jeff, it's Austin." "Who?" "Austin, from the airport." "Remember the guy that I gave a cigar?" "How's the hotel, Jeff?" "Fine." "Jeff, I'm in a terrible fix. I went to the restroom at the airport and somebody took my bag. I have nothing. Can you help me out?" You have to remember that it was a day and a half ago when I met this guy, and bingo, he's thinking I taste like white meat. I had to think fast on my feet, so I went with the truth. "Sorry, Austin, I don't have much money." Now I'm slowly getting the picture, and it wasn't pretty. This guy knows where I am, and he expects to feed. I wasn't going to anger him by saying no. "How about $20, Austin? Will that work? How will you get it?" I'm thinking he's going to step out from behind a door, but no, he says he'll send a girl in the morning to pick it up. Okay, I'm game, literally, and I knew it. What's her name? Uni. This is like slow pitch, I thought. I'll leave it in an envelope because I'm leaving in the morning for safari, I lied. Okay, Jeff, thanks a lot. 8 flights up the stairs, and I'm thinking, what the hell just happened here? I wasn't sure, but you can bet your assets that at first light, I was packed and out of there. I did leave the $20. It's that Midwestern upbringing. He might truly have had his bag stolen, and I might have helped him out of a jam. But I doubt it. No sane person from Nairobi would leave their bags sitting unguarded while they went to the bathroom. Anyway, I was out of there and back on the street, again. Not the place I really wanted to be, but I knew it was time to move. I searched for and found my 2 freelancers in front of the Hilton and asked them if they knew of a safe hotel. They were more than eager to set me up in a $20 a night place that was supposed to be nicer than the previous place, I hoped. After dumping my pack at the new hotel, these guys took me around the town and showed me where, and more importantly, where not to go. I hate to sound like an ugly American, but there are a lot more places where you didn't want to go than there were places where you did want to go. We went to the country's National Museum in the center of Nairobi and toured it. The exhibits would have been interesting if you could have seen them. The lights weren't on. They were either conserving electricity or didn't have the replacement bulbs. That's how poor Kenya was. Unbelievable if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. No money, no tourists, no future. That afternoon we went to Karen Blixen's house, the one from the movie Out of Africa with Robert Redford and Meryl Streep. I didn't care for the movie, but it was a pretty stone house surrounded by a defunct coffee plantation. Apparently, the plantation was located at too high of an elevation, and the rains were unpredictable. In the evening, we returned to the hotel, and Christopher and Aggery left. I hunkered down in the hotel bar and restaurant. The strange thing about this hotel was that no one else, besides me, was there. Business was dying on the vine, and tourism had all but died, except for the rich and famous. And that definitely left me out in the cold. In my case, it was the blistering heat. Nobody in his or her right mind would enter such an environment. The fact that I was the only white person I saw the entire day should have been a big clue. But I was still looking for a pickle recipe to see if I could make something out of this brine. The night brought no real surprises, and I was happy to see that the bug population in this hotel was of a higher class and a more manageable number. The next day, the guys and I made our regular visits to the phone shop for the calls to America, and I spent the usual $30 to $50 per call. No Russell. Hell, I thought, I don't need Russell. I can live and be happy in Nairobi. Ha! Only a Jimka would think such a thing. I was determined to find the pickle recipe that day. If only I had known that the vinegar was turning rancid. Russell would show. I was banking on it. I would wait until he did. In the meantime, I'd make the best of the situation. I contacted my guides, who were always stationed in front of the Hilton. I told them I wanted a day trip out of town. They were happy to oblige. You have to understand, I was the only foreigner I saw on the streets. The rich tourists mainly hid out at the upscale hotels and were shuttled by hired drivers. There was an English-looking guy one day on the street, but he disappeared early on. You're only allowed glimpses when you're in the river of life. Look fast, because only yesterday stays the same. After that, history always has a tendency to change. History. That's what this is all about. You live, and then you want to tell about it. But you can't. All you can do is fill in the time slot. You try to tell the truth, but it sticks in your throat. Nobody wants to hear the truth, let alone see it. I saw. I wish I hadn't. Sometimes it's comforting to have your head so far up your ass that you think you're in a rose garden. There is no garden. It's just a field, and we all have to till it. We're only as strong as our weakest link. I'm in trouble if it turns out to be me. Sometimes the flashes of what was fill me with anger, and I start to preach about what should be. What is was the reality of the moment, and I had my share of moments in Nairobi. What moment am I in? The third or fourth night? I lose track. During my stay at this new hotel, I actually went through one whole night with no real scares. While I waited for Russell, my guides and I roamed the streets of Nairobi. They took me to places where only the tourists would go, and the places where only the locals would go. Both situations were spooky. The ghosts of tourists past were everywhere, but there were no tourists of the present. Just me. We went to one large coliseum on the outskirts of town where I was treated to an afternoon of performing dancers from many different tribes. Each set of dances was prefaced with a short synopsis of the tribe and its location in Kenya. The dance troupes would enter and perform before a stadium that seated at least 5,000 people. Watching from this open-air seating arrangement, covered by a large thatched canopy, were my guides, one small clump of white people huddled together on the far side, and me. It was the same everywhere I went in Nairobi. I was usually the only tourist there. One day we traveled to a reserve somewhere to see Nancy. Everyone stops by Nancy's. She is the talk of the town. Nancy is a giraffe. Every tourist stops by Nancy's tower to feed her and feel the magic of a giraffe. Giraffes are the gentle giants of this world. For the most part, they won't mess with you, but if threatened, they can stomp a fully grown adult human into mincemeat. Nancy and I had a talk. She was sweet, but with an extremely long tongue. It was rather unnerving to have a tongue wrap around your hand and delicately extract the food pellets from your open palm. That was Nancy's charm. Something so big and yet so gentle. It humbles you, at least for a while. After a few pictures of Nancy and her big boyfriend, I wanted a special shot. I gave Christopher my camera and told him to snap a picture of the two of us when I had Nancy hanging over my shoulder, eating out of my hand. I tried to fool Nancy into thinking I had food in my hand. Nancy's larger boyfriend loomed over my shoulder, and it would have been a great shot. However, Christopher was confused by the digital camera, and in the meantime the male giraffe realized the deception. Let me tell you, when a giraffe gets pissed off, it takes its head and swings it at you. I immediately recognized the aggressive behavior and ducked out of the way. I went to the bucket of food and retrieved some as penitence for the big guy. I had learned my lesson. In this country, the belief is, unless I can feed off of you, you're nothing to me. Always be prepared to feed. It's better than fighting. After another fun-filled day in Nairobi, making telephone calls and trying to stay out of harm's way, it was time to go back to my hotel. Still no word from Russell, and the sun was going down as I secured my door. But it didn't take too long sitting in a stark hotel room before I began to think of venturing outside. I knew that 2 doors down the street from my hotel was a bar. By now it was dark, but I thought it was hard to believe that anyone would notice one little old white boy slipping inside for a cold brew. Boy, was I wrong. As the darkness settled on the street, I was beginning to feel a little full of myself. I was alive and existing in what would be considered primitive conditions. But hell, 2 doors down? What kind of trouble could I possibly get into? I made the decision to venture out. It was only 2 doors down. It was easy. I was inside the door, had a beer in my hand, and was looking for a secluded spot to just sit and observe. I found it and leaned back. Then I saw it coming. This guy came walking toward me. I recognized trouble right away, but I had to stay cool. He walked up, put his glass of beer on my table, smiled, and said, "Help yourself." He then stumbled off to the bathroom. Shit, I thought. As he went through the bathroom door, I picked up my beer and started chugging it, walking toward the exit. My only mistake was to stop and finish my beer. As I hammered it down, a guy in a suit at the bar started talking to me. "Where are you from? What do you do?" "On business," I replied. "Business is bad in Nairobi," he mused. "I noticed," was my response, trying to be non-committal. "We are going to have to change things," he said as his eyes started to light up. "What do you mean?" I responded stupidly. "People are going to have to die." "I don't condone the killing of children," I said, not knowing what else to say. "People must die," he said in a cold, despondent voice. Okay, I'm in way over my head. All I could think was, how do I gracefully get out of this conversation and get 2 doors down and 3 flights up before the revolution starts? I just smiled as the guy launched into a rant. At the same time, the drunk from the bathroom found me and asked, "Are you running away from me?" No, I'm just tired and have to get back to my room for some sleep." He smiled and said, "I'll go with you." Great, I thought. Now we had 2 things to converse about, gay pride and revolution. An in-depth discussion did not ensue as the Bolshevik, who was preaching the violent overthrow of the government, returned and ran the drunk guy off. I waited for a strategic moment, bolted out of the bar back to my hotel and into my room, locking the door. So much for a quick beer and a whiff of the local atmosphere. I stayed in my room that night and ordered room service. You know you're in trouble when your first 2 choices for dinner are temporarily unavailable. I started searching for something that might be available and hopefully without disease. I ordered 2 dog burgers, they certainly weren't hamburgers, and 3 beers. That should have held me until morning. It would have been sufficient for a normal human being, but a normal human being wouldn't have been where I was. And where was I? In the middle of nowhere. Perhaps just a bit east of there. I slept well that night until about 3 o'clock in the morning. When I woke up, I had nothing to do but maybe read for a while. I certainly wasn't going outside in the dark. It wasn't more than half an hour later when I heard it. No, I didn't hear it. I felt it. It was a scream in the dark, like I have never heard. It was not an eek, like someone screams after seeing a mouse. No, this was a scream of terror. It began in the belly of a female, and it blasted out the top of her head. Then there was silence. One of those silences I'll never forget. Nothing. Nothing but silence. I tried to make sense of it, but logic no longer worked. Let's see. Sleep, reading, scream, silence. What's that mean to me? Do I go out and investigate? Do I call 911? No phone. What should I do? I did nothing. There's no shame in that statement. I did nothing. I sat there on my bed and listened to silence. I tried to replay the events in my head, anything to develop a plan. I did nothing. I feel ashamed to this day. I just sat there and analyzed my situation. I listened to silence, and then suddenly, there were a series of shorter screams. Then again, silence. I'd like to think it was some errant traveler's nightmare scream, but I don't think so. It was a scream of terror. Only the sun brought relief to that night. The next day, I decided I'd had about all I could take. I asked my guides to find me a way out of Nairobi, and by that afternoon, I was on my first day of safari to Kenya's National Park, next to the Nairobi airport. The park was close to the city and boasted an assortment of wild animals, selected by the government for tourist viewing. The only major animals not held in that park were elephants. They had a tendency to charge the planes that were landing, so they had to be removed. African safari. Let me explain about being on safari. Imagine driving through the San Diego Zoo in a vehicle, sticking your camera out the window, snapping a picture, and then driving off down a poorly kept road, looking for the next shot. I wasn't impressed being led around by the nose to gawk at the local beasts of the day. The only way you could really appreciate the scenery was to leave the security of your vehicle and to venture out into the bush. This was not allowed, at least for the majority of tourists. So until that opportunity arose, I had to make do with the hand I had been dealt. After half a day with a group of strangers who, for the most part, didn't speak the same languages, my nerves were somewhat unsettled when I returned to my hotel for the evening. Still shaken from the night before, I requested room service and had a few beers before I was able to nod off. I awoke to gunshots, an explosion, and sirens. Or perhaps the explosion came first and then the gunshots. Whatever it was sufficient enough activity to wake me. I listened for a while from behind the curtain as I peeked out my hotel window. Once the shouting died down, I went back to bed, rolled over, and wondered, like the rest of the city, if I would see the sunrise. The following day, just when I had mustered up the courage to go outside after breakfast, I literally stumbled over the dead guy on the street corner. It was a shock at first. I was on the street, riding with the current of pedestrian traffic, when the black tide suddenly spread before me as they skirted to one side or the other. Then, the dead guy. I don't know if he was dead, but he sure looked like it to me. His pants were soiled as a result of the body letting his spirit go. There was no movement, no motion, no one lifting a finger to help him. The crowded sidewalk simply adjusted its path. The image entered your thought processes, and then, instinctively, you simply adjusted your course to expose yourself to the least amount of contact. The commonality of the event must have allowed the visual to slip from the minds of the daily commuters as they made their way in their own life and death struggles in the stream of commerce. I was becoming like the rest of them, hardened and guarded. The only difference was that I walked around the block so I could inconspicuously take a picture of the poor fellow. Oh, it was tastefully snapped from underneath my shirt, not really a stop and gawk kind of thing. I just needed a picture as proof that I wasn't dreaming this absurd scene. I was merely a bit player in this theater of life and death. This was Nairobi. It changes a person's perspective. The poverty, the disillusionment, the hopelessness. Nothing like it. The next time someone complains about the way things are in America, I suggest we give them two choices: a 2-week visit to Nairobi or 100 whacks with a wet bamboo stick. I'd take the wet bamboo stick. The following day, I finally was able to talk to Russell. He still had high hopes of completing a settlement, and that we would eventually hook up in Nairobi. Then it would be on to his triumphal return to Lake Victoria. By now, however, I had set my limit. If there was no Russell by Sunday, there would be no Lake Victoria adventure. Instead, I'd be out of Nairobi and would go on a 5-day safari by myself. But in the meantime, I'd have to fill time and try to stay out of trouble. Not really one of my fortes. Once again, the magic hand of fate stepped in. During my half-day safari to Kenya National Park, I met Omar. He had lived in New York City for the last 13 years, but was originally from an island off the coast of Saudi Arabia. Morissesi, wherever that is, and I'm sure I didn't get the spelling right. He was Muslim, but he said he wasn't practicing. I don't think any of them are practicing when they're away from home on holiday. Evidently, they can turn their religion on or off whenever they want. Okay by me if it works for them. Omar was decent to me, and we enjoyed our conversations together while on safari. We agreed to meet for dinner the next night, and share the cab ride out to the restaurant called Carnivore that our tour guide said was a must. I hooked up with Omar at the Hilton in the late afternoon the next day. It was the first time I had actually been in the hotel. It was more like a palace compared to the one where I was staying. I used their restroom for customers only, while waiting for Omar to join me in the luxurious lobby with multiple chandeliers. Upon entering the restroom, I wondered if they would let me sleep on the floor. It felt so safe and was such a clean, pretty place with a wonderful hygienic scent to it. But it was not to be. We were chauffeured in an old British-style taxicab selected by the hotel security force, the bell captain. I felt like I was in a James Bond movie. Carnivore was a private reserve tourist establishment on the outskirts of the city where you go to eat meat. Any kind of meat. The government granted the restaurant, located at the National Wildlife Reserve, a license to harvest wild meat and then serve it to the tourists. It was great. Zebra was the best. Very succulent, moist, just melted in your mouth. Back in the States, someone asked me, "Isn't it like eating horse?" "Yes," I responded. "Giddy up." Anyway, after the meal, Omar and I made our way back to the Hilton. He asked me to join him for a beer, but I politely declined and said I'd rather be dropped off at my hotel, as it was already dark. He knew the wisdom of staying off the streets, but insisted that I join him on a one-day safari the next day to Lake Nakuru, his treat. He said he felt safer if someone else was with him when he was in a cab. Since Russell wasn't here, I could certainly be bought for a free ride from my hotel from hell, so I said yes. It turned out to be a very good day. Any day out of Nairobi was a good day. The cab driver Omar had hired was a decent tour guide, but the cab we rode in had a broken windshield. There was a major smash on the passenger's side that had spread large cracks over to the driver's side. The driver had to continually move his head up and down, left or right, to get a clear line of sight. Omar and I just tried not to look as he honked his way through the city traffic and milling pedestrians. I asked him how the window became damaged. He replied, in disgust, that the anti-government demonstrations last week had turned violent. He wasn't against the demonstrators, but they had no reason to break his window, and he felt that lighting cars on fire was way out of line. Once on the outskirts of town, the driver took us to all the hot tourist spots, which was easy to do with the temperature being well over 100 degrees, in hopes that we would buy something so he could get a kickback from the vendors. Omar had a heart of stone when it came to that, and finally told the guy we weren't interested in trinkets. Me? I just kept telling the vendors that I had no cash, and all I had was an American Express card. It was the truth, and it worked great as a shield. The "Don't Leave Home Without It" card is a great buffer against buying unwanted merchandise. In remote areas, no one will accept it. It was a hump and a half, perhaps 100 kilometers, to the remote park where we saw lots of animals and very few tourists. Perhaps 2 other vehicles? In a park that is known for its gigantic population of pink flamingos and several families of black rhinos. The guide said it used to be packed with vehicles. He stopped once so we could eat a picnic lunch that Omar had the hotel prepare for us. But the flies bothered Omar so much that he requested we eat in the cab with the air conditioning on. It was okay by me, but I really didn't think the flies were taking any more than their fair share. Road rage. On the way back to town, Omar and I were in store for yet another treat. While chatting in the back seat of the taxi, this huge roaring sound suddenly went screaming past us, followed by some colorful language from our driver. I was certain I heard Jimka in the flurry. Before we could even ask, another series of roars went flashing by us. Race cars. It seemed that somehow Omar and I had become unwilling participants in the annual Race Across Africa. Race cars, like those that you see in the Baja Road Race, were winging past us, totally out of control and with no respect for beat-up taxicabs or potholed roads. They passed on curves, over hills, and on the left or the right. It didn't matter. How we weren't killed, I'll never know. All the way back to town after the first wave had passed, a Johnny-come-lately would occasionally blast by. We weren't watching the parade. We were in it. One of those dynamic adjustments in the path of life that make you feel alive. After a full day of sightseeing and several near-death experiences, we returned to the Hilton for a few drinks to settle our nerves. Quite a few, actually. Omar was buying, and I was quickly running out of money while waiting for Russell. I graciously accepted his hospitality. I was good company, at least for a while. Everything was pleasant enough until Omar noticed 2 women at the bar sitting by themselves. The entire time he was staring at them, he was telling me how dangerous the women are. Even though he kept saying it as if to talk me out of it, I already knew I didn't want any part of what he was planning. The more he stared at the ladies, the more they toyed with him. It was okay for him to play games, unattached and 26 years old, but being married and in love with the person I live with, I didn't want any part of his plan for the rest of the evening. I left Omar to play his dangerous game by himself at about 10 p.m. He was in a somewhat inebriated condition, to say the least, and I wasn't much better. I was out at night, alone. It was beyond scary. It was sobering. I had violated all of the major no-nos that the lady had told me at the American Embassy. I had no money left to buy my way out of the situation. All I had on me was my hotel key and passport. And worst of all, because it was dark, I was unsure of my location. Some might say I was lost, but I knew the basic direction I needed to go. I simply had to work my way around the neighborhoods until I found my hotel. The only problem was that these were the same streets in which all the rioting had taken place the night before. I knew the moment I passed the gated security of the Hilton that I was fresh walking meat in the jungle of nighttime Nairobi. Fear has a way of clearing one's head. I knew I couldn't just wander the streets aimlessly. Unfortunately, staying in the Hilton's restroom all night wouldn't work either, and I was sure Omar was going to have a full house that night. So I did the only thing I could do. I ran. I ran like the wind. When I left the front gate of the Hilton, I was in full stride. Running for your life has a way of doing that to you, puts you in full stride. I was a runner as a kid, so it came naturally. I had used a similar technique once in Boston's combat zone, when I was on a business trip and found myself way in over my head. I ran. I did not jog the white man's death jog. I ran for my life. I ran out into the middle of traffic and ran as fast as I could down the center lane. Dodging traffic and pedestrians alike, I propelled myself through the back streets like a gazelle being pursued by hungry lions. Once, passing a bus full of people, I told you I was running fast, I saw a little kid, perhaps no older than 4 or 5 years old, hanging on to the outside of the bus, catching a free ride, looking at me in amazement. I remember thinking at the time, what is he doing out at this time of night, hanging on the outside of a bus? He could be killed. I spotted my street and made my way through the honking traffic. Once at the door, I took the steps 3 at a time, up all the flights, and did not stop until I was locked in my room. I would write safely in my room, but there was no safe in this town. The only reason I made it was because I ran. I ran past any potential threat before they could react, and by the time they did, it would be too late. There's nothing like running for your life to break a sweat. As the water poured off of me, I began packing my bags. If Russell wasn't there by tomorrow, I was going on safari without him. The next day, I was able to reach Russell via another $20 phone call. The answer was no. It wasn't going to work. He wasn't coming. I was to go on without him. I did. Out of Nairobi. Leaving a friend behind is never an easy thing to do. It will probably traumatize me for years, and I'll probably never get over it. Not. Once the string was cut, the burden of waiting was eliminated. The next commitment I made was to see as much of the country as I could before I went home. The skids were already greased. Christopher and Aggery had scheduled a safari for me on Monday morning. It was to be a 5-day trip. I wanted 7, but that would have meant extending my stay by 1 day. I was actually on my way to call Diane to discuss it with her when my guides and I happened across a young couple from California. Always the entrepreneurs, my guides asked them if they would like to go on safari. The couple politely declined, saying they had already been on one safari for 2 weeks. I interrupted and asked how they liked the Northern Territory. They said it was okay, but it was similar to Southern California. If you were lucky, you might see some camels. It was basically desert. That settled it. A 5-day safari into the Serengeti would do me just fine. That was Sunday morning. All I had to do was make it to the next day. Fill time, if you will. Christopher suggested we go to a football game that afternoon. I said I was game, not realizing that I was game in more ways than one. Christopher arrived at my hotel door about 2:30 in the afternoon. The game was to begin at 4, but since we were working on Kenyan time, that meant we had an hour and a half to walk to the stadium. Christopher brought another freelance buddy, Andrew, along for the ride. Tickets were only $1 apiece, so I sprang for them. The football game, soccer to those of us who know the difference, was a special one. It would pit the number 1 team against my guide's team, the LUO, a local tribe that goes beyond the man-made borders of politics and imaginary boundaries. Even though the game is a little different in Africa than America, it's the same. Half of the stadium is from one tribe and the other half is from another tribe, and there's no intermingling. That was obvious. But, once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first order of business was to enter the stadium. Unlike our stadiums, the parking lot was basically empty. Everyone walked to the stadium, and there was no such thing as a hot dog, cotton candy, or beer vendor in sight. Not that I wanted beer, but you sure as hell didn't want to drink the water coming out of a faucet. These people could only afford $1 to watch the game, and that was all the money they spent. The entire stadium was cement, and it was big. I would bet it was designed to hold 100,000 people. The stadium was in direct sunlight, but if you were a big spender, you could reserve a spot in the shade under an awning, on opposing sides, for an extra $1. We, of course, sat in the sun in the heat of the day, and I kept wondering how long my sunblock would hold out. That was back in the days when I believed in sunblock. It was hot, hellish hot. Standing in a long line for about an hour, we slowly made our way through a one-person ring-around-the-rosy gate that bottlenecked the entire operation. But who was I to give advice? I was just the one white guy in a 50,000-strong Kenyan crowd that was anxious to see a soccer game. As I stood in the midday sun, I looked at the armed guards standing in strategic points around the stadium. I wasn't accustomed to seeing people packing automatic heat, but it appeared fairly benign to me. That was until one of Christopher's friends started talking to me. He was an older gentleman who seemed to have everyone's respect. A leader, if you will. Although he was not introduced to me as that. He was just Andrew. But as Andrew talked, I knew I should listen. "Jeff," he said almost paternally, "if something happens and we should have to run, you make sure you stay close to one of us, or you may wake up and not know where you are." This guy obviously didn't know he was talking to a 5-time full Ironman triathlon participant, and I wasn't about to tell him. If there was going to be a movement, there would be few that could catch me. Maybe in a sprint, but even then, they would be in trouble. I live by one very firm tenet: run if you can, kill if you must. There is no in-between. But it's just a game, right? Wrong. The competition was like a scene from the Roman Colosseum days, but this was tribal warfare in a civilized setting. The two opposing tribes established their war camps on opposite sides of the field. The field itself was centered inside a running track. The grass was cut short on the playing field, but was long, uncut, and unkempt everywhere else. At the center of each war camp were men pounding on drums and people screaming their high-pitched squeals until the chant grew to a fever pitch. It was like something right out of a movie, and I was right in the middle of it. What a hoot. Our team lost. A 2-1 defeat. But it was close enough that there was no real bloodshed. There was a little scuffle on our side of the field, but they thought it was most likely the locals beating up the coach. He seemed to be having a tough go of it, and the fans didn't mind taking matters into their own hands. The only other violence was during halftime, when a war party broke from the crowd with their drums pounding, double-timing over to our side of the stadium. As they chanted and pounded their way over, I couldn't help but think that the only thing missing were their spears. Once the war party was in front of our team's cheering section, they taunted the crowd. Both sides worked themselves into a frenzy until suddenly the attacking war party captured a chair from our sidelines, bringing cheers from their side of the stadium and wails from ours. Then they hightailed it back to their side of the stadium with the chair. Now, this set the offended tribe, our side, into a tizzy. There was a call to arms, and our tribe fielded a team of volunteers to recapture the treasure, the chair. We sent our war party over, driven on by the opposing tribe's jeers and our cheers. The resulting clash concluded with the return of our chair. Before the whole stadium exploded into bedlam, it was time for the second half of the game to begin. We may have lost the game, but since the chair was rightfully returned, there was no real harm done. Halftime was the highlight of the event. The only thing better than the end of the game was surviving it with my hide still attached. The stadium, being nothing more than a bowl of cement benches, was, to say the least, a bun burner. People brought cardboard to sit on in an effort to lessen the blistering. Nobody else complained about broiling in the sun, but wow, what a hot day. Safari. On Monday morning, the driver from the safari office met me at the door of my hotel. I had just returned from mailing a letter to Diane via FedEx, and I was blown off my mark as he hollered at me to quickly gather my stuff. I replied that I was told to be at my room between 8:45 and 9. It was only a little before 8:30. No matter how you paint it, they rushed me. I grabbed my bag in a hurry and left my only pair of underwear hanging from the bathroom shower curtain. It wasn't a loss, but it did mean a new level of freedom. The word safari is actually a contraction from a phrase the first explorers used when dealing with the natives. "I say, old boy, how far do I have to go?" The natives, not liking to be called boy, even back then, dropped parts of it and shortened it to sa-fa-ri. The meaning of the word transformed into the act of taking the explorer or explorers on some type of vision quest for treasure for a fee. The word quickly became part of the Swahili language. Death on these treks was inevitable, either for the unfortunate animals who happened to be in their way, or for the explorers themselves. Once on the road out of Nairobi, I took stock of my situation. Now that I was sure Russell wasn't coming, I couldn't wait to escape Nairobi. It was a great relief to throw my pack in the van outside my hotel. A young kid about 28 was riding shotgun. There were 2 red-headed females, an older one and a young one, in the seat all the way in the back, and that was it, even though the vehicle could have easily handled 10 to 12 passengers. I sat on the left side in the first seat behind the driver. I had come to the conclusion that this was the safest place to reside in case of a collision. Drivers will always subconsciously or consciously take evasive action most beneficial to their own survival. As I stated, tourism was somewhat non-existent due to the state of emergency that had been declared by the government. These folks in the van were going to be my traveling companions for the next 5 days. The older lady, in her 50s, and the younger one in her 20s, clutched their packs on their laps, and we shook hands over the top of them. English, I knew by their accents. The mom, Jane, was born in South Africa, but she and what turned out to be her daughter, Susanna, now lived in London. Matt, the 20-something, was a practicing doctor in Tuma at a small hospital treating 200 to 300 outpatients daily. Malaria, HIV, accidents, you name it. This kid had to deal with it in some makeshift field hospital. Matt was of Irish descent with a touch of an accent himself, but he went to school in Denver, Colorado. He was a talker. Perhaps it was because he hadn't been to America in almost a year and had very few people to converse with in his village. The ladies and I listened intently as he began telling us his life story while watching the landscape pass by. So this was our merry little van of tourists. 4 Caucasians, and Fred, our driver. Fred was a member of the largest tribe in Kenya. However, the current leader of the country, President Moi, who happened to be from one of the smallest tribes, was somehow elected in a contested race. How he managed to do this, no one knew for sure, but he was in the process of transitioning all political appointments and higher-paying jobs to members of his own tribe. Fred was very vocal on this point and told us that this was the reason for the violence and unrest sweeping the country. We were lucky to have Fred. He had been a driver on safari for over 20 years. Recently, he had only been working 2 weeks a month due to the drop in number of tourists, but now things were getting even worse. Fred wasn't a very outgoing sort of fellow. He dealt facts like a head shaman, few and far between, and basically would only speak when spoken to, and only then if he thought you were worth talking to. He didn't talk much to me. When we brought up politics, you knew immediately that the situation in Kenya was not good. If you brought up President Moi, Fred would just shake his head. I brought up Nairobi once, and his only comment was, "I hate it there." I understood that feeling, and I didn't have a wife and 2 kids living there. But that's what's so great about safari. It can make you forget about responsibility, duty, guilt, and everything else that can bind a person up inside. Visions of grandeur go away. You become small, meaningless. The further you go, the smaller and more meaningless you become. Soon you become just another traveler on a rotten road wondering about the two age-old questions of antiquity. 1, when do we eat? And 2, when do we stop to use the facilities? The true journey was the one going on inside the soul. We may move physically through the environment, but it's the journey within our belief system that moves us from I am to I am nothing. The environment in Africa is incredibly harsh. My boyhood dreams of exploring the deepest, darkest depths of the interior, meeting up with Tarzan and swinging on the vines, had caught up with me as I was bouncing along on a dirt path in a rear two-wheel drive van. The freeway system in Kenya is one of the finest you'll ever come across. You are free to drive any way you want, but you best be aware that everything is fair game. And you are free to die here. The roads, the paved ones, are few and far between. The ones they do have run between the major cities of Kenya and are full of potholes. Unlike the frozen Northland, where I come from, the roads here do not break apart because of the constant freezing and thawing. These roads explode under the intense heat of the sun. Just a few miles outside of Nairobi, the plains of the Serengeti spread toward the south. At that point, the rutted roads of ancient paths seem to network in a pattern that only the locals understand. Once on the open plains of the equator, it isn't hard to imagine sitting on the surface of the sun. Oh, some may say it's a different kind of heat. Blistering comes to mind. But the fact is, air conditioning is reserved for the rich. The rest of us sweat it out with the windows down or, in our case, in an open-air van. Foolishly, at first, I tried to capture every moment with my camera, until I realized I needed to slow down or I would be out of film on the first day. I tried to capture the depth of my experiences, but the photos do not do the moments justice. I tried. I could only point and shoot. The pictures failed miserably to describe the scent of the scene. You can't feel the dry air surrounding you or the odor carried in the wind. You can only hope to explain it. I'll try, but just as the photos failed to express the environment, a moment in history, if you will, I know that my words will also fall short. I'll write about safari, but just remember, this is only my feeble version of history. The Serengeti. We traveled in a van with a canopy over the top flapping in the wind. The height of the vehicle had been expanded to allow a tall person to comfortably stand. The cab was a standard shell protecting the driver from the elements and open to the back. The rear of the vehicle had windows on the side that encased the passengers in a steel frame with ample room to stand and snap a picture through the top flap. I quickly discovered that by standing in the aisle that went through the center of the passenger compartment and leaning over the front enclosed cab, I had the perfect place for safari surfing. This spot allowed me to stand and take pictures while supporting the camera on top of the cab and feeling the hot wind rush across my face. As we slowly made our way across the Serengeti plains, I stood there for hours at a time until my legs ached. It was still better than sitting. As I said, sitting for any long period of time is never an option for me. I must move. It's in my blood. To stand in an open van with its sudden lurches also meant that you might catch that perfect shot. I just wanted that one award-winning photo that would sum up my safari experience. My foolishness was apparent to all. Our driver Fred said it best. "Sometimes I think the best pictures are up here," as he pointed to his head. I couldn't have said it better myself. There was a lot of time to fill on safari. It was not constant movement in the back of a vehicle. It took money and gas to drive around all day, so there were daily stops and walking excursions into the wild, designed to eat up some of the time and let the passengers unwind. On one particular day, the Swahilis took the English ladies, Matt, and myself on a successful elephant hunt. There were no guns involved, only cameras. The guides had only their walking sticks and clubs with them, so we decided against a direct frontal attack and thought it best to watch the elephants from the other side of the valley as they foraged through the jungle. I didn't know if they were the same ones we had seen earlier that day. Our guide drove us right up next to them as they were ambling along over the hot, dry plains, but this herd was moving at the same steady pace. How can I relate the experience of silently and cautiously existing in the presence of such majestic creatures? I can't. Awestruck would be the closest word. It was pure destruction on a slow roll. They just kept creating this massive wake, rippling the wilderness as they moved. No wonder the African civilizations in their path would just as soon see them disappear. Fools that we are, we don't even recognize that these elephants are the big ants above the ground. Just like the worms and the ants below, the elephants burrow the jungle in a manner that benefits both. One of the main functions of elephants, in the circle of African life, is to temporarily leave the plains behind, forage into the jungle, and create the trails of destruction that serve as a biological haircut. Nature intended the Serengeti to be a wide open plain, a path, a way of life. We humans should only allow ourselves to observe, not control. One of the beneficial features of this pay-in-advance adventure, $65 a day including a bed, breakfast, and everything else except beer and water, was that you stayed at a base camp. I thought at first that base camp meant tourist camp. Now, I'm no mamby-pamby tourist who needs all the comforts of home while I'm out in the bush. Get real. I had already survived a week in Nairobi, so I wasn't thrilled at first about being bussed up to Tourist City in the jungle hills just off the plains. I must admit, though, that I liked base camp, for several reasons. It was nice to have a tent to sleep in, which kept out the mosquitoes and not to mention the bigger creatures that might eat you. It was also nice to have a place where, as they say in the military, you could shit, shower, and shave. It was even nicer to return from adventures in the wild during the day and be treated to a wood-cooked meal at night. But the major reason I liked the camp was because there were very few people. It had been designed to handle at least 200 to 300 tourists at a time, depending on how many people slept in a tent. When we arrived, the total number of white people was 4. All the other tents were empty. We did have a group of 5 from another van join us just before supper after the first day. Where were all the tourists? Turned out, a couple of weeks earlier, just north of here, the guerrillas, not gorillas, had raided a camp, and a few tourists, unfortunately, were killed. Someone had resisted. It got ugly, and if I'm not mistaken, they said about 20 people in total were killed. A little more adventure than I wanted to deal with, and for some reason, it seemed to put a damper on reservations in this area. No wonder we got such a great deal on our safari tour. We drank tea and coffee that first night while the cook prepared our meal. The dinner bell's ring usually filled 20 tables. We all sat at one. The food itself had a mysterious quality to it. The main dish was always spaghetti or rice with an assortment of toppings served from different buckets. When we were finished, the leftovers were used to feed the local Maasai tribesmen in our camp, who were used as guards, dancers, and tour guides. When they were finished, the animals from the bush moved in. The baboons were a nasty lot. Matt, the doctor from Tuma Tuma, and my bunkmate at base camp didn't want anything to do with them. I had branded Matt with the nickname Batman because, as his life story unraveled during our safari, it seemed appropriate. He was a young kid who started out wanting to save the world, but during his residency in Africa, had become somewhat jaded along the way. "Stay away from those baboons. Nothing but teeth and germs," he said. Well, I really wasn't planning on hand-feeding any of them, but you have to understand baboons. They've got nothing but time on their hands, and they will take any opportunity to raid the tents for food. We were warned to keep our belongings packed and secure at all times, because baboons were notorious for raiding unsecured tents. I understood better than most. One afternoon after lunch, I was sitting in the mess tent talking to a couple from Sweden, or perhaps it was the goat lady. when I saw this black shadow moving across the back of the bunker where they stored the food supplies. It was just starting to register in my head what it was when this big son of a bitch baboon leapt down onto the table next to ours and grabbed an errant ketchup bottle that shouldn't have been left unattended. He looked me in the eye, let out a big-ass scream, and leapt back into the ceiling escape hatch. After a couple of Tarzan-like moves, which were pretty impressive, considering he was carrying a ketchup bottle with his foot, he did a 3.5 gainer off the roof of the hut, grabbed a branch that bent almost to the ground under his weight, and finally let go of the branch while transferring the ketchup bottle from his foot to his hand in mid-air. He hit the ground and took off running like a striped-ass ape, as they say. He could have it. I wasn't going to tell him no. Jaded in the jungle. Batman didn't play the tourist game anymore. When the local merchants would try to work him as we walked around starving little villages, he would tell them that he lived in Africa. This was usually enough to make them turn away, realizing that he was a definite no-sale. Using his words, "I'm not going to play anymore," meant that there was nothing in this country that he wanted. No meant no, not "I want a lower price." He didn't have to play anymore. He was heading home, taking this last opportunity before he left to see something other than the emergency ward or the inside of a hut. He was burned out, ready to be served up to the American health system. Batman was pretty good at keeping his inner feelings in check, until we hooked up with the goat lady over dinner. The English ladies had been talking about the goat lady earlier in the day in hushed voices, as if not to spread ill will or gossip. It turned out it wasn't gossip. The goat lady was a loon from Australia who was boasting about how she had taken 10 children off the streets, bathed them in her hotel, given them clean clothes, and then returned them back into the streets. Batman asked, "Why?" Me? I too had some problems with that whole picture, but then again, who was I to judge? Having dealt with loons before, I did my usual retreat from the conversation and escaped with my principles intact. Batman stayed and fought it out with her while I went over to the campfire and danced with the Maasai. But fate dealt some irony the next day when, for some reason, the goat lady was transferred to our tour van. Punishment for past sins, perhaps. Hers or ours, we'll never know. Now, don't get me wrong, she was like the rest of us. She just had a few qualities developed to a fault. She was telling Batman the story, and that's how I named her in the first place. According to her, she had saved a dying goat in one of the little villages that dotted the landscape. Apparently, the goat had keeled over and stopped breathing, and a band of tourists, she being one of them, gathered around it. Someone must have shouted, "We need to do something!" Well, the goat lady, being a practicing psychologist, medically trained, you know, and on holiday, couldn't help herself. She leapt upon the goat, thumping on its chest, blowing into its nostrils, and reviving it. Yes, really. I had a hard time not laughing. Batman was in total disbelief, and, not being able to hold his tongue, asked, "Why on earth would you even touch such a disease-ridden animal?" The goat lady totally ignored his question with a flip of her head. When she started questioning the doctor for medical advice as to whether or not the animal might have had anthrax, why she thought of that, I don't know, I had to excuse myself and headed to the front of the van to do some safari surfing, leaving the two of them to debate the issue. Batman had all sorts of stories about human life and death ordeals. Some he would share with the group. Others only came out late at night in our tent after a beer or two. Bedtime horror stories, I like to label them. For some reason, I have found that humans enjoy sharing their misery. One story I will never forget, and I bet he wishes he could. He was holding his stethoscope to the chest of a young child. He heard the last heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Nothing. The young mother showed very little emotion. Life has a different meaning in Africa. Intermission. December 5th, 1998. Dear Fred and Father, speaking of life, what can I say about it? The more I try to capture it, the more it moves on with me in tow. Yesterday I put Court and Diane on a plane to New York City with Aunt Jo and Angie. Taylor and I are bacheloring it up. He doesn't get in my way, and I don't get in his. I think they call it male bonding. He and his friends seem to clean up after themselves, so what more can I ask? Today I rose early and ran Wolf for 5 miles around a man-made lake here in Omaha. People made comments while we were running that I should ride the beast. Perhaps it would slow him down. His name fits him, as he looks like a wolf, but perhaps I should have called him Umbukali, Swahili for crazy dog. After running, I now find myself at work on a Saturday morning, cleaning up a database or two and getting ready for Monday. Looking through my file of things to do, I see Nairobi.doc. I think, finish it, but I remember all the other things I should do and waver for a moment. No one else is in the building. I try to fulfill my fiduciary obligation to the corporation, but I finally give in to my inner desires. I must write. Current history is turning into past history right before my very eyes. I tell myself, as I always do, that stories are like a fine wine. As I blow off all responsibilities, we will see if that is true. Jeffrey. Safari, Part 2. Safari on the Serengeti is like riding a continuous wave in the ocean. The land moves beneath your feet as you ride the safari vehicle through herds of wild animals. Everywhere you look, life roams the land the way it did years before we were able to capture it and tame it. Or so we thought. We really haven't captured anything. We're simply in the process of destroying it, unknowingly or vindictively. I would say it's more an act of ignorant arrogance. Human encroachment is destroying the animal's historical paths. We're just following ours. The scary thing that history teaches us is that we tend to destroy what we can't control. I hope we don't ruin this paradise, at least for the animals. It would be a worldwide tragedy. The Maasai, a nomadic tribe, seem to coexist with the nature of Africa. In this big area of nothing but land and wildlife, these people raise cattle. They live in the middle of nowhere, and each member of the tribe takes his or her turn guarding the cows. Cows are their life and their most prized possession. With good reason. You need at least 3 of them to buy yourself a wife. It is a tradition that everyone honors. In Nairobi, the cows don't always change hands. Money of equivalent value will do. I asked my 2 city guides about this custom, and they confirmed it early on during my trip. They said depending upon the woman, the father would accept an IOU. They also said that if the marriage didn't work out, you had to give back the cows. Life here is simple. One day as we were riding the safari wave, we had a flat tire on a rocky road. Fred said something in Swahili that I wish I could remember, because I'm sure it was a good word to use in a nasty situation. Everyone had to pile out of the van and unload the back. As we were doing this, the most amazing things started to happen. People, Maasai herdsmen, popped up out of nowhere. They were all in red, as this is the tribal color of the Maasai. First, the kids appeared, and amazingly, knew how to say, "Picture, 50 shillings," while holding out their hands. I wasn't interested in dishing out any money, since I was running low, and I wouldn't have a chance to access any from a bank until we returned to Nairobi. There were several children, so I tried to barter with them. A picture for a granola bar. It may have worked if I had been a little quicker. By the time we had almost made the deal, a few mothers showed up. Hanging from their hips were additional small children. The flies they brought with them came in staggering numbers. They swarmed the lips of the babies and their tear ducts. Around the nipples of the nursing mothers, the flies nibbled at the dried, caked-on milk. Indifferent to the flies, the mother said the same thing. Picture, 50 shillings, while holding out their hands. I indicated no by shaking my head, and instead pointed to the jewelry on their wrists. Handcrafted body ornaments made out of beads. 200 shillings, they said. I didn't have 200 shillings to waste, so I shifted the barter back to the granola bars. No deal. Money for a picture, that's the rule. I knew I had lost the negotiations when it was time to load our belongings back into the van and be on our way. Not wanting to be a poor sport about my defeat, I handed them 2 bars to share as we drove off. My happiness at doing this act of kindness was quickly followed by a tinge of environmental horror as the women ripped the packages open and broke off pieces to hand out to the children hopping up and down. Then they tossed the wrappers of tinfoil, letting them blow away in the hot savanna winds that bathed us. I watched in disbelief as the silvery foil blew off into eternity. No one would ever pick up that garbage. It would be on the plains long after the humans. I'll have to live with that guilt. The lesson was once again as simple as the land. Everything you do in this world has a consequence. Every decision has a result, and not always the ones we plan. This theory ties in nicely with my current philosophy. When you don't know what to do, do nothing. I don't mean to brag, but I'm really good at it. Nothing, that is. Once on the road again, the senses are flooded with visual stimuli. Wherever I looked, I wanted to capture the image and take it home. It just didn't work. But what wasn't on the film was all inside me. I felt bigger having been there, but my personal and biological worth to the world and the environment began to pale in comparison. Safari makes one feel small, but in a good way. The pure power and rawness of nature humbles a person. Viewed from the security of a moving vehicle, it lulls you into this almost hypnotic state. But, as with all good things, if you do it for too long, it becomes monotonous. That's why I started to look forward to having breakdowns with the van. It got the blood pumping. In total, we had 3 flat tires and got stuck twice. I enjoyed each malfunction. It gave me an opportunity to walk, push, pull, or go exploring. Fred never allowed us to wander very far, but I would have loved going for a cross-country bike ride. I'm sure that would probably have been a good way to get into trouble. Fresh meat was always attractive to animals, as well as humans. To be honest, I felt like I was nothing but game the whole time I was there. The only thing that saved me was my fight-or-flight instinct, and believe me, flight was always my number 1 choice. Perhaps that was what made our excursion with 4 Maasai guides memorable. To be standing in waist-deep grass along a path on the side of a mountain, looking across a valley at foraging elephants, fighting the flight instinct and traveling all the way into fright, well, it just didn't get any better than that. Of course, pulling off ticks and wondering what other kinds of pests besides snakes and lions were hiding out there did make a person pause to think about the sanity of the situation. Another high point of the trip was the valley along the stream near camp, which was filled with baboons. It is one thing to see a couple of apes shout at you from the monkey house in the zoo. It's a rather humbling experience to have a whole troop of them scream at you as you violate their boundaries. As we crossed the creek, climbing over large stones, hundreds of baboons screamed and hollered, leaping from tree to tree and making threatening gestures at us. I kept looking for the ketchup bottle, thinking I could pay penitence for the granola bar wrappers if I could find it and dispose of it properly, but to no avail. Evening around the campfire was always an interesting experience. Each night at the main camp, new people arrived and would join in conversation over tea until supper was ready. After supper, those of us who were willing to pay 500 shillings were invited to watch the Maasai dance their tribal dances and do their infamous leaps into the air. They were amazing, and I thought it was well worth the money. But probably even more phenomenal were the sounds they produced without using any instruments. After they finished dancing, they would join the tourists around the fire until the last of us went to bed. It was also their responsibility to run and fetch beer, and you can guess who were the last dogs to go down: Batman and me. It was during these evenings that we became good companions. He was Irish and proud of his drinking ability. Since I was German and running low on funds, I graciously accepted his hospitality until the wee hours of the morning. The poor Maasai were sleeping in their chairs, even though we told them to go to bed. I think it was their job to keep the animals from eating us. We felt bad having to wake them to fetch us more beer, but we got over it after a while. The best thing about drinking beer into the wee hours of the morning was the kidney breaks. Each time you stepped away from the fire to find a secluded place to relieve yourself, the stars would fill the sky and the senses would sharpen. A clear, moonless night of stargazing on the Serengeti was like being engulfed by the universe. Batman even made mention of this fact. He tried to pick out constellations, but since every star was so bright, it made it difficult. Orion's belt was directly over our camp, but other than that, I only knew there were a lot of stars. During the hours of conversation with Batman, he shared many of his experiences during his 2-month residency at Tumatuma. He also talked about his life back home. Batman talked a lot about everything. He was definitely an alpha personality type, but he was a good kid and an interesting individual. He was always saying that I gave a new definition to the term generous to a fault. Being from Denver, he understood the Midwestern upbringing, but after 2 months of being the focus of constant demands and begging, he had become hardened. It was sad to see someone that young become so jaded so quickly, but it was a statement on the current condition of Africa. He and I had been approached by one of the Maasai guides to do a little trading, so one morning we met with this gentleman in our tent. It was old-world bartering from the beginning. Batman wanted a necklace for his girlfriend back home. The guide went into his tent and returned with a nice one, along with a knife and a game club for throwing. All the items were spread out on one of the sleeping cots. It turned out the doctor wanted all of the stuff for his office wall, when he finally got one. He started emptying his own bag of stuff on the cot until we got close to an agreement. He put up his boots, a raincoat, and a shirt as his first offer. The guide said he also wanted 3,000 shillings. Batman turned to me and asked what I thought. Suddenly, I was in the middle of negotiations. I told him to throw in a pair of dirty socks, give the man 1,000 shillings, and call it a deal. That seemed to make everyone happy, and the trade was completed. However, now I had caught the trading fever, and had decided I wanted one of those game clubs. The guide didn't have another one, but since I said I was willing to trade my binoculars for a club, he said he would do what he could. The next morning he showed up with my club. That meant he had traveled through the jungle during the night to reach his village to get me one. To travel at night, even for a Maasai, meant that he really wanted those binoculars. I also threw in a jar of peanut butter that I had stashed away as a hidden reserve. It was heavy, and I was tired of lugging it around. Besides, I'm sure his family enjoyed it. Batman just scoffed at me, saying that damn generosity ruined a perfectly fair trade that was already complete. Why? Perhaps it was a weakness on my part, but he guaranteed me that it was an uncommon trait in this part of the world. The main camp on the Serengeti was special, but I was happy when we headed for Lake Nakuru. The lake was in a park in north-central Kenya, but it meant I was heading back toward Nairobi, a plane, and home. I was definitely enjoying this part of my adventure, but home always pulled at my heart. Life is not fair. I want it all. The excitement, the adventure, the family, the friends. And we might as well toss money into the equation just to make sure it is a comfortable life. Why is it that the human part of us always makes us feel that the current moment isn't as good as the moments we had in the past, or the ones we're going to have in the future? I guess it's a sifting process that our memories go through that helps determine our individual definition of judgment. I try to fight the past and the future and go for the moment, but I talk tough now. There were moments in the Dark Continent I wouldn't want to repeat. Reflection. Moments. That's what Africa was to me. As time passes, those moments fly constantly through my mind as memories, slowly working their way into my past, a past I will always cherish and am destined to forget. That is why I write, pitifully trying to capture the past to save it for the future. Many of my moments in Africa will fade over time, but hopefully a few will be retained. I still remember the concentration camp we stayed at on our last night on the road. There's nothing like driving through a gate into an area surrounded by walls and barbed wire. You'd think a person would be tentative about it, but the alternatives are few. The city of Nakuru, the fourth largest in Kenya, was under curfew. In by 9 p.m. or be shot or fined, depending upon whether or not you had money. I'm not sure, but this may have been the area where President Moi and his henchmen had killed over 1,000 people who had rioted against government policies. Whichever way you sliced it, it was an uneasy situation. 5 tourists in a place that was designed for 100 or more prisoners. But for the moment, we felt a false sense of protection in this camp. The guards outnumbered the guarded. Batman and I toured the inside perimeter of the stalag, and we each posed for a picture, pretending to break out of our confinement. But trust me, neither one of us wanted any part of what was going on outside our barbed wire walls. Instead, we were more than satisfied to sit around a roaring campfire that kept the mosquitoes away until it was time to turn in. The next morning, we left at daybreak in order to complete our tour of the park surrounding the lake. The game was plentiful, and the flamingos literally blocked the sun in a mass of pink as they filled the air at our arrival. There was a high concentration of rhinos in the park, but no elephants. The entire wildlife refuge was surrounded by an electric fence and patrolled heavily to stop the poachers. It was my second trip to this park, since I had visited it with Omar on the one-day safari when I was hiding out in Nairobi. Each visit was different, based on which rutted road we took in our successful search for the rare white rhino. But by then, there was only one direction in my mind: home. I knew that once I said goodbye to Batman, the English ladies, and the goat lady at our drop-off in Nairobi, I only had a few hours left to find a hole and crawl into it before sunset. One more, most likely, frightful night in a hotel, and I would be on my way to the airport. The tour had a taxi waiting for the English ladies and the doctor. Batman told me to take care and not to be so gullible. I wished him well, and before you knew it, it was over. The safari was over, and there I stood, alone on the corner, not knowing which way to go. Nairobi again. My basic instinct when not knowing which way to go is to go forward. But having no bearings except somewhere in Africa, it was hard to know which direction was forward. So I just moved, quickly and with purpose. Hesitation gives off the air that a stranger is fair game. I did a fail-safe maneuver, which always worked well for me in the past. I picked out a tall building as a landmark and then spiraled out from there in ever-expanding circles. From there, I spot another tall landmark and start circling it until finally, after several jumps from landmark to landmark, I began recognizing the surrounding area. Once I knew I was close to the American Embassy, I started looking for a place to stay for the night. I knew I didn't want to stay at either of the hotels where I had already stayed. To let anyone know that I only had one more night in town could expedite a thump and run. I remembered seeing a fairly nice place down by the market area and decided that it would be my last stand. I didn't go by the Hilton and reconnect with my guides. One goodbye was enough, and I was aware of the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. I figured at this point that my best offense was defense, holed up like the scared rabbit that I was. As I walked to the hotel in what was now turning into an early evening, I made my way along the dirt roads that line the market area. I remember the smells and the music the most. The scent of food filled the air, as did the music with its raw tribal beat. Simple sounds were being pounded out by the beggars who had talent and owned an instrument, or over hidden ghetto blasters that pulled electricity from somewhere and redistributed it to the huddled masses in the form of an energy that spoke to the soul of the country. Along the streets there were large kettles that held stewed meats and vegetables that the locals could purchase. The size of the black kettles brought memories of old movies where the natives would stew up an explorer or two. That thought alone kept me moving, not to mention eating the gruel and then passing the bowl to the next person in line. I entered the hotel, and luckily for me, they accepted American Express. Finding my room was pretty easy. and the fact that there may have been one or two other guests in the place also helped. Then again, maybe they weren't really there. I never saw another guest. Each floor had a security guard monitoring the halls for protection. After dumping my gear in the room, the false sense of security with the guard in the hall made me feel safe enough to leave my backpack in the room and go downstairs to the restaurant next door. I had been walking the city for half a day with nothing to eat, so hunger had the ability to overpower my fear of venturing out. I ate quickly with my head down, not wanting to establish any eye contact with any of the other patrons. As the sun was starting to set, I left a tip and fled back to my hotel. Good thing. I had dumped all of my possessions from my pack onto my bed when I first got to the room. I planned to review my treasures and repack for the flight home after I ate. I had my club, which I kept handy, a huge bean pod that the Maasai used to ferment milk and cow blood in, several pieces of jewelry made from beads and stones, my filthy clothes, and a camelback water bag I brought from home filled with water that I always carried in case of an emergency. After dinner, when I returned to my room, there were 2 maids there under the pretense of delivering towels. They always traveled in pairs. I think it was a safety precaution since violence was everywhere. They were looking at my bounty when I entered. They smiled, left the towels, and quickly left. Nothing was taken from what I could tell, but I was glad I returned when I did. I knew that I should stay in my room until my flight left the next day, but I was out of ammo, aka I didn't have any beer bottles to put in front of the door or to use as a weapon. I needed to risk one more venture out to the hotel lobby to purchase some warm beer. Selling cold beer would require refrigeration, and that would cost money. The security guard greeted me as I closed and locked my door. I asked him to make sure no one entered my room. He smiled and agreed. Then, holding his stomach as if he had a bellyache, he asked if I could get him a Coca-Cola. Extortion in its purest form. I said sure. I wanted him on my side. I returned with a 6-pack of bullets and a Coke. I gave him the drink and he thanked me. I went inside with my beer, closed and locked the door. I just wanted to make it through the night. It couldn't have been more than a minute before somebody was suddenly knocking on my door. From behind the closed door, I said, "Who is it?" "Security." Great, I thought, just what I need. An attack before I have my bottles empty and set up as my first line of defense. With one hand loaded, holding a full bottle of beer, I unlocked the door but left the chain hooked. Like that would stop someone. Opening the door a crack and looking over the chain, I saw the guy I had given the Coke. He smiled widely and said in a hushed voice, "You want a woman? I can get you a woman." I almost laughed in his face, but knew better than to do that. I just said no and closed the door. So much for security. The only person I wanted to be with wasn't in this country. I quickly set about packing and slowly started emptying my bottles. It was a long night. The TV didn't work, so it was pretty much a night of listening to the angry mobs howling and prowling outside. My flight left at 8 in the morning, so I set the alarm for 6. It was no more than a 20-minute drive to the airport, but I wanted to make sure I was there in plenty of time. It would turn out to be more than enough time. After I showered and put on my rinsed-out clothes, I loaded up, quietly walked past my sleeping security guard, dropped off my key at the front desk, and headed out the door to find a cab. And who was waiting outside? My 2 previous guides. They had tracked me down. I was the only game in town, and word traveled fast. They smiled and asked if they could assist me. Sure, was my answer. "Gentlemen, just get me to the airport." They did. We grabbed a cab, they rode with me, and when we got out, I cleaned out my backpack, giving them all my clothes except the one clean shirt I kept for this trip home. I took the shirt off my back and gave it to them. I even gave them my emergency plastic bear of honey and my last jar of peanut butter. I put on my clean shirt and then took off my Nike tennis shoes, gave them away, and put on my African sandals made out of used tires that I had purchased. I gave them all the change I had left, genuinely thanked them for keeping me alive, and wished them luck. I walked to the ticket counter to catch my 8 o'clock flight for home. Boy, was I in for a shock. It seemed that in my angst to flee, I misread my ticket. The departure time was not 8 o'clock in the morning. It was 8 o'clock that night. That was a long 13 hours, but I really didn't mind waiting. I was broke, and there was no way I was going to wander anywhere except inside this barbed wire compound. Like a caged animal, I paced back and forth throughout the day. There were no banks around to get any money, and I had given away my entire stash of emergency rations. Bummer. I just wanted to be on the plane before the Civil War broke out, and I couldn't think of a better place to wait than inside the safety of the airport. My flight from Nairobi to Amsterdam was long, and I slept through most of it like a newborn baby. Amsterdam. Before landing in Amsterdam, I looked out the window and saw nothing but gray until we broke out from underneath a blanket of clouds. Only then, and just briefly, was I able to see the barren fields of a winter day in the Netherlands. The early morning sun was very weak at 6 a.m., and so was I. My flight home didn't leave until 6 that night. Having just spent 13 hours waiting in an airport lounge, I decided early on that my pack and I were going through customs, and then I was going to have a look around the much-maligned city of Amsterdam. Disembarking from the plane into the airport gave me an immediate feeling of civilization and safety. The place was clean, well-lit, and a beehive of activity, even at that time of day. After I made it through customs, I rushed to the nearest phone to call Diane and tell her I was alive. I had not talked to her the entire time I was gone. Remember, I had only talked to her dad that one time. Either I never had access to a working phone, or I called at the wrong time. While I was in Nairobi, I had been writing to her on the back of computer paper that I purchased from a reluctant desk clerk. They didn't like the idea of giving away any of their supply until cash was on the table. Then, in those lonely hours when I was waiting for the door to be kicked in, I would write to her and tell her about my day and how I loved her, and that if I didn't make it home alive, to let the kids read the letters. Otherwise, burn them. In those letters, I told her how scared I was, how I regretted leaving her and the kids in such a mess. In essence, I let it all flow to the paper, which was terribly hard because I hadn't used a pencil in years. Every day I would then risk life and limb to go down to the FedEx office and overnight the letters to her at exorbitant prices. But it was the only way they guaranteed that it might get through. Regular mail was being opened by post office personnel as quickly as it came in. It was everybody grab what you can time. I just felt that if I could get my letters through, she would at least know how it ended. But now I was going to be able to tell her by phone that I had made it out alive and not to worry. We would talk about the letters when I got home. I was sure she would be in a panic. The phone rang. She answered. Tears rushed to my eyes, and from my trembling lips I was able to squeak out, "I made it." "What?" "Sorry, it's not a very good connection." "What?" "The kids and I are getting ready to go down to Worlds of Fun in Kansas City. Quiet, you guys. You can say hello before we hang up." "What? What? Sorry, I didn't get that. Letters? What letters? We haven't heard anything since the last time you talked to Grandpa, and you said everything was okay and not to worry if you didn't call until you got back. Everything okay?" Yep, everything was okay. After we finished talking, I felt strong again, emboldened by the fact that only one person knew about my plight. Me. The trip wasn't over yet. It was time to see what downtown Amsterdam looked like at 6:30 in the morning. After retrieving some local currency from our handy-dandy American Express office, I found myself outside the airport walking over to the train station. That was when I realized that I had just traveled from the equator to the final days of winter in Europe. The air was filled with a cold drizzle, and the wind slapped me in the face as I put on my nylon windbreaker and pants. Of course, that didn't help warm my feet any, which were only covered with a pair of white tube socks and my recycled tire sandals. Not to brag, but I think a weaker man, or at least a smarter one, would have turned around and gone back to the airport. Because it was early, and the fact that it was a Sunday morning on top of that, the train into town was pretty deserted, except for a few other travelers and me. Looking out the window, there was no picturesque Van Gogh presentation. There were only barren fields on a gray landscape for miles on end, and occasionally rows and rows of greenhouses. Arriving at the train station was a somewhat humbling experience. The building is huge and beautifully built in, how shall we say it, a Dutch motif. The town square next to the station was almost totally void of people. Walking out into the chilly winter air perked me up and put a hustle in my stride. I used the train station as my first landmark and then ventured forward, moving in my traditional circular pattern. That plan didn't work too well in a city loaded with canals, so I quickly changed my paradigm and decided to follow them. Even as cold and windy as it was, the Dutch painters of the history books slowly presented themselves to me one by one. Everywhere I looked was a thing of beauty. Rows upon rows of little shops, all of which appeared to be closed when I first hit the streets, were now opening in an orderly fashion. It was starting to snow, and now my socks were wet, and my cold feet led me into a little shop next to a canal crossing. I went inside to get warm, grabbed a cup of coffee and something to eat. The clerk spoke English and most likely 10 other languages. They seemed to be a very articulate and intelligent society. She recommended the special of the day, and as she was preparing it, a local walked in with a whoosh of wind. He ordered a Heineken and a shot of something and then was off and running. Well, when in Rome. After the man left, I ordered a me too. I liked this place. After being refreshed with food and drink, it was pretty much your average walk and gawk. By now, however, the sun had come out in full force, as had the locals. The squares were jammed with happy, smiling people, and the streets were crowded with bicycles moving along in harmony with the buses and the streetcars. The canals were lined with houseboats, and the tour boat activity was beginning to pick up. Flowers from the greenhouses lined the streets, and it seemed as if everyone was carrying a bouquet along with their freshly baked bread. And just like that, it was time to head back to the train station. Luckily, I have endurance and a good sense of direction. Okay, maybe I don't have a good sense of direction, but my endurance allowed me to wander aimlessly until I found the station at 3 that afternoon. Reluctantly, I headed back to the airport, but not before making a vow to myself that someday I would bring Diane to this beautiful city. It was definitely a place you wanted to share. After making it through customs, the flight was an uneventful journey back to the burial grounds they call corporate America. But I had found the answer to the question that I had been searching for in Africa. Life, and this story, can be summed up in one word: home. Jeffrey.